Okay, afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming on this rainy afternoon. This is a continuation in the series of town halls about the financial crisis and the economy. And this one I think is particularly important because it cuts to the heart of one of the critical issues, which is how do people make decisions, and does the way in which people make decisions influence the response in a crisis. You know, as you prepare yourself to be a business executive, there are really three skills, broadly speaking. One is analysis, which everybody's good at when they get here, and we hope we make you even better at it. The second is those making decisions. The third, of course, is convincing others to go along with your decisions, which is leadership. But there's very little sometimes that we talk about the science of decision making. And that we have three experts on the faculty today. I'm not sure which order you are about to go in, but so we'll go in alphabetical order then. So Gita Johar, Eric Johnson, and Nachum Sicherman. Gita and Eric are in our marketing faculty, and Nachum in the finance and economics faculty. So let me turn the program over to you. After they have made a presentation, I'll get back up and help moderate Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Glenn. So I'm Gita Johar. I'm a professor in the marketing division, and I do a lot of research in consumer behavior. I'm going to introduce you to three of my projects today. I thought three is the magic number. So I'm going to introduce you to three of my projects today. And they all have to do with this idea that there are cues in the environment, or things that surround us, that influence us in ways that we don't know about, and that we would not like to happen, that happen anyway. And it's going to get more concrete as I give you the examples. But the idea is that we all think we're independent and rational human beings that make very well-considered decisions. But in reality, we are often swayed by things in the environment that we would rather not be swayed by. So this research hopefully can help us answer these questions. Why did people trust Bernie Madoff with their life savings? That's a big question, but maybe a little bit of it can be explained by some of my research. Why do psychics see an uptick in business during a bad economy? This is something that's apparently been observed. Psychics charge anywhere from $100 to $1,000 an hour. So you'd think their business should go down in a bad economy, but it turns out their business actually goes up. So again, another example of irrational consumer decision making, and I'm going to try to talk about why that might happen. And the last one is something that's very close to my heart. Why do we reach for chocolate cake after writing a check for the Red Cross? Or why do we reach for chocolate cake at all? Would be even better question. So let's start with the first question. Why trust Bernie Madoff? So you have Bernie Madoff there on the left, and you have Michael Perry on the right. The guy in the middle is the phantom guy. I'll talk about him later. So if you look at Bernie Madoff and Michael Perry, who was the CEO of IndyMac, you see that they both have very round faces and somewhat large eyes. And some of these facial characteristics are common to what's called the baby face prototype. So the baby face is a face that's round, big eyes, small nose, small chin. That's the complete package. But here you see at least two of those characteristics. You see a round face and you see big eyes. And a lot of research, including mine, shows that baby faces tend to be trusted more. People think they're honest, and people think they're innocent. So in many situations when you'd rather not be trusting these people, you end up trusting them just because of how they look. So let me describe some research I've done in this area and how it has been applied to marketing and more decision making in this context. So the phantom guy in the middle is the guy we showed in our studies. And this is a guy who we portrayed as being a CEO of a company, a big medical company. And he was somebody who was out there apologizing to consumers. So what we told subjects in our study is this guy is apologizing to consumers because his company has been accused of putting a drug out in the market that has severe side effects. And we said that either 1% of the people or 10% or 20% in different groups of people were told either 1%, 10% or 20% of consumers would be affected by these side effects. And this guy was apologizing and claimed he didn't know anything about it, and he was the CEO of this company that put this drug out in the market. Another group of people saw this guy. So it's the same face, it's been morphed. The face on top is baby face characteristics. The face at the bottom is more mature characteristics. And we tested these faces so that they're equal on likability, equal on intelligence, kindness, and a bunch of stuff. But what they do differ on is whether they fit this baby face prototype or not. So given what I've told you before, it should come as no surprise to learn that the group that actually saw the guy in the top photograph making these claims of innocence believed him more, did not punish the company, and felt like it was just a mistake that this drug had been put on the market. On the other hand, the guys who saw the CEO at the bottom, they felt this was a really horrible company, it should go out of business, and this drug should never be allowed onto the market ever again. So a very simple thing like the CEO's face had quite profound consequences in terms of what consumers, in our case the subjects, felt should be done with this company. So that's one example of how a face can really have a huge impact. I can hear a lot of questions in the audience about, there's a lot more we know about companies than just the face of the CEO. So that is true, and yes, anything else you know will reduce the effect. In our studies, these are companies nobody's heard of. But still, in many cases, we make decisions in a hurry. We don't know that much about every company we're reading about, for example, and we can be swayed by very subtle cues like this. One interesting thing is that if the side effects are really massive and 20% of consumers have been affected, then it turns out the face matters a little bit less, as long as people have time to correct their judgments. So a big theme in all of this research is that consumers are not really aware of what's going on. So when we ask our subjects, what made you think this company was bad, or what made you think that this wasn't intentional, they won't tell you it's the face of the CEO. And they tell you it's a bunch of other things. It's to do with the drug, and side effects are common or not common. So they come up with justifications that actually have very little to do with how they really make their decisions. Because in our studies, we control for everything else, and the only thing that's different in the two conditions I talked about is the face of the CEO. All the other information is kept constant. So even though that's the way we design our studies, what consumers think is that they're swayed by content and not by context. And so through a set of 4 or 5 experiments, we're able to show it really is the face that drives these judgments. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So this is, as I mentioned before, a real phenomenon. It turns out that people go to see psychics more. So in the last year, psychics have been seeing a booming business, one of the few sectors that's booming. And some of the research I've done seems to suggest that this has to do with people wanting to feel in control. So a human desire is to feel that you control what happens to you, that you control the outcomes, and that by your behaviors you can determine what's going to happen, whether you're going to have a good outcome in the future, pass the test, get the big job, do well in life, whatever it might be. You want to feel like you can control that. And it turns out that psychics fulfill that sense of control, because when everything around you is fading and everything around you looks like it's not going so well, you kind of think, okay, if I go to the psychic, at least they're going to tell me something that gives me control again, that tells me what to do or tells me what's going to happen, and I feel like I'm in control again. So I'll just briefly describe the studies we've done. They have nothing to do with psychics, but it's merely an implication or an application. So in our studies, what we do is put people in situations where they have to take a test, and then they're given feedback. They take a test, for example, in 2 different rooms. So in one room, it's kind of the lighting is poor, it's not so nice, so think like Dungeon of Urus Hall or something. So you're either taking the test in the Dungeon of Urus Hall or in this nice Meyer Feldberg space, and you are given feedback on how you do on this test. So again, we have these experiments where we manipulate between conditions. Either people are told they're doing really well on the test they're taking, or they're told they're doing really poorly. And in the critical condition, what we do is tell people they're doing really well when they take the test in the Dungeon of Urus Hall, and tell people they're doing really poorly when they take the test over here. So when that happens, what they're doing is kind of thinking that there's a correlation between where they took the test and how they performed on it. Okay? So as a result, what happens is in the end, when you tell people, okay, there's a big test coming up, where do you want to take this test? They're more likely to choose the inferior alternative than the superior alternative, just because they think they're going to do better over there. I'll give an extreme example. So you're probably going to tell me that, well, they really can do better, there because they've done better in this space, and maybe the Dungeon of Urus Hall has something that makes them do better. Maybe, there's something in the environment. So what we also do is we do studies where it's not themselves, but they're supporting a team. So for example, they're supporting the Columbia team doing well on some kind of a trivia quiz. And we give these people Snickers candy bars to eat as they're watching this trivia quiz. And every time they eat a Snickers bar, the Columbia team gets ahead. So Columbia does better than Yale, for example. And what we find is after 4 such episodes of eating Snickers and Columbia doing better, when they're offered a choice between Snickers candy and Kit Kat candy, people are more likely to choose Snickers if they think that's going to help their team, although when there's no match going on in the same situation, they would rather choose Kit Kat because, frankly, after eating 4 Snickers bars, you don't really want that 5th one, you'd rather switch to the Kit Kat. So again, you're doing something that's very costly to you, so we call this costly superstition, because you're giving up on a preferred alternative and taking an inferior alternative because you feel that's going to help you achieve some desired outcome. It also turns out in this case that when you ask people why did you make the choice, they don't know. So they're not aware of why they did what they did, and they don't intend for it to happen, and they can't control it. So just as in the baby face study, in this study as well, we find a lack of awareness and doing something that's less than optimal, or that would be economically called irrational behavior. So my last and most favorite example of why eat cake. In most of consumer behavior, we look at how people make a choice at one point in time. So one thing that I was interested in looking at is how does a choice you make at one point in time affect your next choice that you make down the road. So in this series of studies, what we do is we make people go shopping, and people are tempted to either buy something or not to buy something. And what we find is if they choose not to give in to the temptation and not buy something, then they feel somewhat proud because they haven't given in to temptation. And when they feel proud, they then can justify something that they do that they feel they shouldn't be doing. So they give in and they eat the cake. Okay? But if they give in to the temptation, then they kind of feel they've acquired something, they feel happy, but they're not proud anymore. So they're less likely to go for that chocolate cake. But what does happen also is that how they respond to advertising is also influenced by whether they buy and give into temptation or not. So we've also shown these kinds of ads where we ask people to buy software, and the same ad is positioned either as an ad that's about pride or an ad that's about happiness. And when people don't buy something and are therefore feeling proud, what we find is they are more attracted to the ad that shows the pride appeal, whereas when they have given in, bought something, and they're feeling good about having a new, something new, they are more attracted to the happiness ad. So again, over here what's happening is people don't know why they're responding one way to the pride ad or the happiness ad. They're 2 different groups of people. They don't know it has nothing to do with their previous shopping behavior, but yet they can't help themselves. They're more influenced by one appeal than another simply because of the way they feel as a result of whether or not they've given in to temptation. Okay? So those were just 3 examples. A lot of the research I do really looks at this idea that people have no awareness of why they make the decisions that they do. So my bottom line conclusion is if we can kind of try to isolate all these phenomena and think about them, they're all then aware of these kinds of biases, and maybe in the long run, just maybe we can kind of insulate ourselves against it. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to be here, and I want to talk to you about 2 things today. One is hearts, literally, and the other is purse strings. And the hearts are literally going to talk about organ donation, and the second thing we're going to talk about is how to save to retirement, or how to encourage saving to retirement. I was just at a large panel run by the National Institute of Health about the science of changing behavior. And the topic was, how can we use behavioral economics to change people's behavior? And those are the 2 behaviors I'm going to talk about. Behavioral economics, I'm going to take 2 seconds to tell you how it's different. It's the same in lots of ways. We think incentives matter. Okay? We also think that people try to do well. It's just they're probably not as smart as most economists think they are, and they're not able to do well as much as they think. Incentives actually are different because they think about them differently. So I want to talk about 2 major departures. The first we call loss aversion. Has anyone here heard about loss aversion? Raise your hand. Well, we're making an impact. Of course, half of them are faculty, but that's another thing. Loss aversion essentially says a loss, let's say $5, hurts more than a gain of $5 makes you feel good. And that's going to be a very important concept and an important departure from standard economics. The second is a really fancy word called hyperbolic discounting. It just means basically if you think that people have an Excel net present calculator in their head, you're wrong. There's a great normative theory about how we should handle discounting money over time, but how people do it, they are one, very impatient, and two, they discount very quickly. It's not a constant rate. I'll explain that in just a second. So how does this apply to hearts and purse strings? Well, let me talk about organ donation. This is a huge problem. I actually got interested in this when I was a stem cell transplant survivor, where I was my own donor, which is great. But for 100,000 people in the US, they're on the waiting list right now. In lots of the world, this is in Lahore, Pakistan, there's a black market for organ donation. Standard economics thinks there's a solution, and it's a market failure. So you'll find economists saying the price of a kidney should be $10,000, and we should have a market. I mean, that's fair. That is a standard position. Now, I want to suggest there are other diagnoses. One is incentives, either the market-based pricing or payment of burial expenses. There's actually a candidate that people have been talking about. We should pay people funerals, things like that. Another thing, being a marketing professor, is an obvious starter, which is persuasion. We should persuade people this is a good thing. I want to suggest the behavioral economics alternative, which is choice architecture. That basically we pose choices to people in ways that influence their behavior, much like Gita was saying, but why don't we pose them in a way that actually helps them make the choice that's not only right for society, but actually it turns out, in this example, what they would choose if they were forced to choose. Now, how many of you know what the default for organ donation is in the US? Are you a donor? You have to opt in. You have to choose to be. Well, Dan Goldstein, who was a wonderful postdoc here, who's now a very successful faculty member at LBS, and I were very interested in this because we realized a bunch of European countries, the opposite is true. You're a donor unless you opt out. Now, that should not make a big difference, should it? So we did a web-based study of real people, and they either were told they were going to a new state and everyone is not a donor unless they choose to be, the US system, or they are a donor unless they choose not to be. And we actually had a neutral condition where it was a web page. They had to make a choice before they moved on. Everybody understand this stuff? So here's the data. In the opt-out condition, almost exactly the same as in the US, 42% of people decided they would be donors. In the opt-out condition, 82% said they would be donors. So that's almost a 2-to-1 difference. The interesting thing to us is the neutral condition, which was 79% said they would be donors. Suspect that if you make people make a choice, they want to be donors, but frankly, is making the decision to be an organ donor pleasant? It's actually rather unpleasant, so that suggested that actually perhaps opt-out would have a big effect, and perhaps actually reflect people's preferences. This slide, we actually contacted the donor registrations in a number of European countries, and this is a place where I don't know a lot of econometrics, but you don't need them here, because the graph on the left, your left, are the countries that you have to opt in. The bars on the right are the countries you have to opt out. I mean, that's a no-brainer. And actually, I sometimes get some of my German-speaking friends upset. Some of these countries look pretty similar, like Germany and Austria, Sweden and Denmark. I mean, but of course, it's a casual observation, so this is a very convincing slide. It's so convincing that many of my friends say, you should stop there. You shouldn't go into the econometrics, but I will. You can actually do a regression on the actual number of organs transplanted in these countries. That is not just people's willingness, but the actual organs that are transplanted. And you see somewhere between a 16 and 50%, depending upon the specifications, 16 and 50% increase in the number of organs transplanted in opt-out countries as opposed to opt-in. So this really is a change that saves lives. Okay, that's my work. We were lucky enough to publish that in Science in 2003. The other is not my research. I want to talk about what I think is another great application, and that is encouraging savings. There's a large segment of the population that, for some reason that seems mysterious to many of us, do not save in their 401k plans. Okay, now, this is even the case where there are incentives. They even don't do this when there are matches, which seems like a good reason to double your money, right? Yeah, of course, incentives are one way, the standard economics way of perhaps encouraging savings. A second way, and you've seen these ads, right? They usually have older couple who look very young and have full heads of gray hair walking on the beach and say, save for savings tomorrow. Well, that doesn't seem to be terribly effective. So the question is, can we change the choice architecture? Now notice the first example took advantage of loss aversion. If I'm an organ donor, I'm giving something up by not becoming a donor. If I'm not an organ donor, I'm giving something up by giving. So that's what's going on here. here that will be one thing that's going on, but I'll introduce one other topic. And this plan is a product of two friends, Shlomo Bernardsky and Dick Thaler, and they introduced a plan called Save More Tomorrow. The key is not to get people to give up some consumption now to save. Right? I don't want to reduce my paycheck now. But how about I say, of your raise, remember when you used to get raises? But of your raise, half of it will go towards savings. Notice I'm not hurting by giving up. In fact, I'm just foregoing a future gain. The second thing is hyperbolic discount. Because it's in the future, that amount looks very small as opposed to now. If I was doing net present value, I would do the NPV. No, that's not what people do. The second element of this is very similar. This is a sticky default. I keep saving unless I choose not to. So every year I get a raise, half that raise goes to savings. Over 28 months in the very first study, now there are a number of them, over 28 months, 98% kept participating in the plan, and savings rates went from 3.5% to 11.6%. Now, one thing I'll point out both these is think about how expensive both of these plans would be to implement. I'll get to that point in a second. It was permitted by law, the Pension Protection Act in 2006 actually changed the ability of companies to offer defaults. That is actually, I think it was one of the greatest votes in Congress. In this Congress and Senate vote of 86-0 approved this. It was quite successful. And I just want to point, this is a change of choice architecture. We all pose choices to people, and there's lots of other examples. One is encouraging green consumption, and Elke Weber, who was here, has a nice article in the New York Times about a lot of her research in the area. Reducing healthcare costs. George Lowenstein has done some very nice studies about how you use choice architecture to increase drug compliance. Actually, people take their drugs as prescribed. And I think, for example, would mortgage choice be a beautiful application of this? How do you get people to choose mortgages that won't blow up on them? Okay, so let me close. No. So you check with the default no. First point I want to make is a wide variety of decisions, design decisions influence how people choose. Second point I want to make is it depends on really a deep understanding of how people make choices. And that's going to come from an area that's interesting and happening called neuroeconomics, where people are actually imaging people's brains as they make decisions. And also, I think, a deep understanding of psychology of choice. Last conclusion, everyone in this room, anyone who presents choices to other people is a choice architect. So there's a line you can put on your resume you hadn't thought about. And the second thing is there's no neutral environment. Any environment changes the way people choose. It might be opt-in, it looks neutral, but it keeps people who want to be from being donors. And I want to argue these are three approaches to behavioral change: incentives, persuasion, and changing the choice architecture. Now, lots of us may have political disagreements. There's one thing I would want to say. Changing the choice architecture is usually the cheapest option. In a time where constraints are very real on institutions and governments changing behavior, simply changing 2 lines of HTML code to get the kind of behavior change we saw in the Oregon donation sample is pretty remarkable. And last thing, of course, being a marketer, I have to have the ad. If you want to learn more, I teach a course in the fall we taught by our Schoenberg who's over here called Behavioral Economics and Decision Making. It's usually taught in both MBA and MBA. And there'll be a series of talks this fall where we have world-class experts coming in from the Center for Decision Sciences. Finally, I didn't talk about all those great marketing applications, but when you publish in Harvard Business Review, they give you like too many copies. I have to get rid of them, so feel free to take one. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. A couple of disclaimers before I start. First of all, unlike my colleagues, I have no formal education in psychology. I'm an economist. So the other thing is that although I've been fascinated by behavioral economics for many, many years now, I still have doubts about the field in general. And especially people who basically, by showing that people are irrational, use it as a badging of economists to usually assume in their standard models that people are rational. I don't think that there is any problem with that. I'm fascinated by seeing irrational behavior, as I will show you in my research, but I don't think that it has any problem for economists. It might enhance economic, and I hope that the research that is done in behavioral economics is going to supplement, complement, enhance economic research, but I don't think it's going to replace, at least not now, the standard models that people use in economics. So what I'm going to talk about is research that I've been doing for the last few months with colleagues from Carnegie Mellon and another colleague from Vanguard. it started, well, not exactly, but what brought me into the project was that as soon as the financial crisis started, I talked to one of my friends and I said that all the statements that come from my pension fund, I stopped opening the envelope. So I used to open from time to time, but I have a big pile in my office that I don't want even to look at it. And he said, oh, me too, And the question is that we started thinking about, is it something that a lot of people do? How many people have this experience with themselves here? Okay. So the general question was whether people are, when the markets go down, are more reluctant or less likely to check their balances on their saving accounts, or the other way around when markets are going up. My colleagues started to look at some data set that they got from Sweden. Several months ago, I got a bank with 3,000 customers in Pittsburgh. And the big break was a couple of months ago when Vanguard allowed us to look at more than 1 million of their customers. And right now, I'm looking at about 1 million participants, and I can see every day if they go online and check their account for the lot. Right now, it has 2 full years of data. So I'm going to report some results that are based on the bank from Pittsburgh, some initial results from the bank from Vanguard. And basically, the results confirm what the intuition was. We find, so just to tell you how the data looks like, we have the ID of the person, of the account, and we can see every day, whenever they log on to their account online, we know where they looked, how long they spent, how many times per day they go, if they traded, didn't trade. We can see everything they do without knowing who they are, so don't worry, I know nothing about any of you personally. Vanguard is very, very strict with keeping private information confidential. So what we find is quite strong. We find that when market goes down, the frequency at which people look at their accounts is going down. When markets are going up, the frequency at which they look at their accounts is going up. And it's not continuous. If you look around the zero, there is, like, as econometrics would say, the intercept is changing. So just because the market goes down a little bit has a very strong effect on them looking much less. So there is a break around the zero that shows that the effect is very strong. Now, this is psychology, of course, because there is no rationale whatsoever why you should look at your balances more or less when the market either goes up or goes down. So far, we are very excited with the results that we got. We are playing more. We see whether women are more likely to do it more than men. On the bank in Pittsburgh, we find out something that you would expect if their if their account has more bonds than stocks, then they are less sensitive to market fluctuations when they look or don't look. So we see all kind of interesting stuff about when and who looks and who is more of an ostrich than the other. But the really interesting thing, which we didn't do yet, and that's where I think behavioral economics might become more important, is not just to make this observation, but ask who cares. Why is it important? Well, the channel by which this observation or the confirmation of this hypothesis might be important if it affects trade. So the question now becomes, is there a direct link from the psychological behavior of the reluctancy to look at your account to actual trade? So what is the channel? If for some psychological reasons, it's hard for you to look at your balances or to go online because the market is going down, then the likelihood that you will rebalance your account or you make some trade is going down. So in the economist jargon, whenever you make a trade, there is some cost of doing the trade. And the psychology is that for some reason, when markets are going down, the cost of doing the trade is greater than the cost of doing it when the market goes up. The causation but to confirm this hypothesis, it's not so easy because we don't know whether people don't go online because they don't want to trade, or because they don't want to trade, they don't go online. So you don't know whether it's one way or the other. So our challenge for the next few months is to find some trick by which we can test the hypothesis that the ostrich effect, the way we call it, we didn't call it originally. This idea has been in the literature for quite a while. But the question is whether the ostrich effect is a real effect when it comes to financial markets. Because, as Eric just told me earlier, there is some evidence that there is lower volume of trade when markets are going down, but the challenge is to show that it has to do anything with this ostrich effect or not. Okay. So you want questions now, or?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's very informative. I mean, as a fundraiser, which is a lot of what I do, I'm going to channel my inner baby face. Better.
And a good student.
For all of you, when you become an alumni, you know, your wealth really belongs to the school unless you opt out. So why don't we open it up for questions, because all three of the panelists made great presentations. I also want to note, they all mentioned this all comes from their own individual research as well. So floor is open. Whoever has a question for any of the panelists. Sir.
What's the major change you've seen in consumer behavior after the crisis? I mean, in specific industries, or mainly even in the banking industries, regarding trust to banks, or consuming or doing transactions in banks and things like that.
Glenn would probably know this better than I, but there has been an increase in the savings rate around the market in the last month. So it's non-consumption, not consumption. People are saving.
But doing less transactions, so people are going less to the banks, going less into the websites. I mean, maybe because I would imagine people trust banks less.
I don't. All I know from the banks that I looked at. So, for example, the bank in the bank in Pittsburgh is a commercial bank, and people have full brokerage accounts. So, in order to trade, they have to call their broker, and so these are existing people who have the account, and I watch their behavior. So I don't know what happens more than that. And both in the Vanguard and in the bank, in the commercial bank that I looked at, there is certainly less activity as far as going online and looking at your accounts. So this I know for sure, that people increase the frequency at which they go online when the market goes up and decrease it when the market goes down. But more than that, I don't know.
Let me add one behavioral economic lesson that we've learned. It's actually research that our Deputy Dean Chris Meyer did. When housing prices go below what people expect, they don't sell. The volume of those markets is well known to decrease, particularly for people who are owner-occupied as opposed to investment housing. So very much to your point, we know that, at least in the kind of data that Chris and Genovese gathered, that people don't sell. And that certainly seems to be describing what I hear about in the real estate market in lots of places. It's, even if there were buyers, people aren't trying to sell.
Could you please explain, as a psychologist, how the people actually make the decisions? If the decisions are irrational, they must be made somehow subconsciously. And so how are these decisions made in the brain?
You first.
If I could answer your question, I'd probably make a small fortune. So I think some decisions, at least all the research that I showed today, the decisions are made what you might call subconsciously, in the sense that the reactions to these stimuli are automatic. People don't know why they're responding the way they do. They don't intend to do it. In fact, it's suboptimal for them to do it. As you pointed out, it's irrational. And if they could, they would correct for the effect of this decision. So in that sense, a lot of decisions, and some psychologists might say 50%, are made in this kind of unconscious, manner, automatic manner. But that is not to say that the other 50% that is conscious is always rational either, because that now gets into the issue of what's really a normatively appropriate decision, because the utilities that people have on different things are different. So it's what might be, rational to you may not be what I define as rational, for example. So that gets into a whole other area of research that maybe Eric can speak to. But definitely in terms of the subconscious, subconscious or automatic judgments, that's a large part of decisions we make. In fact, people have shown some really nice findings on behavior. So for example, so I'll tell you a study that's really interesting because it shows that people can observe other people's behavior and really be influenced in very profound ways. So in one study I'm going to describe, for example, people were shown words like Florida and things like that connote old people. And then when they left the experimental lab, they actually walked slower. So, that's kind of amazing that it can actually affect not just judgments, but also your behavior. So I think automatic judgments and behavior are a large part of what we do, but that's only half the story.
You said if we learn more about how we would behave as a result of these kind of behaviors, like with the Kit Kat and the Snickers, is there some learning there? If we learn that we are irrational, does that change our effect? And I can imagine that's about the Snickers, but if it's slightly different, do we still learn there?
No, that's an excellent question. I think a lot of what psychologists and a lot of us in marketing try to do is try to say that if we can highlight some of these effects and people get aware of them, you can correct for them. So a big part of, like, for example, stereotyping literature, which shows that people, like you see a name that seems like it's a woman, which would be quite obvious from the name, but also let's say a African-American candidate applying for a job. So in these situations, people apply their stereotypes automatically, but the fact that there's a lot of publicity about these kinds of biases might then make people correct for them. So a lot of people might say things like, in order to correct for this kind of prejudice, what you might do is black out the name of the candidate and don't provide any information about them, just provide the data about their qualifications, and that can eradicate, for example, some of these automatic biases. So just learning may not be enough, although it should help to some extent, especially if people want to make a difference, want to be accurate and don't want to be affected by these kinds of things. And if they have the time and the ability to do it, they will correct. But even better is if you can somehow take this away, like in the example of the CV, taking away the name of the person.
I'll offer one other example. It's about eating too much. I mean, Americans outside of Manhattan apparently are getting very fat. And a good friend of mine named Brian Wansink has been doing a study of what he calls mindless eating, claiming that you make 200 decisions every day about how much to eat. A lot of them is how many spoonfuls to eat. And something he's done that changes my life is I know I automatically will eat the next chip in a bag until the bag is empty. So what do? I don't let system one, the automatics, to make the decision. I actually pour a small bowl and keep the chips somewhere else. So I have to actually engage system two and say, do I want a second bowl or not? So I think the distinction is that basically making mindless decisions is so easy, and you're unaware of it. Now, if you're aware of it, then you can engage the more mindful system to help you make the right decisions on occasion. I hope that helps.
Can I just quickly follow up on that question? Think about the hedge fund setting. So if I believe in things like overconfidence and loss aversion, how can one work with traders to overcome those natural biases? What do we know from research that we could do?
I had a conversation with a Columbia alum named Roy Lennox, who I know you know, and he said a phenomenon that I know Nachum knows very well. Because of loss aversion, cab drivers today knock off early because they have a target amount they're going to make, and when they make their $200, they'll go home. And Ray came to my class and said, the problem is my traders do the same thing. When they have a good year in November, they shut down their trading desks. So it's a real problem. It has real consequences. What he suggested, there are a couple of things you could do. One is write a fancy contract. This was my suggestion, where you pay people to take more risk at the end of the year. He said, no, we just did something different. We close their accounts in October. So what their dead period happens when other people's dead period isn't happening. And what we also are doing is trying to close accounts, rotate them around the course of the year. So there is a case where there's a real problem that he saw, and Caxton is a very large fund, is my understanding.
Very large, yeah.
And that was a beautiful example, I think, to your point.
Okay. Yeah, Ava?
Of course, Glenn, you asked about finance. I'm going to ask about calories. So I was thinking about the putting the calories on the
the food now in the fast food stores and how that affects it. And I just read a story about how you go in and you don't get something that has high calories at that moment, but after you leave because you feel pleased that you didn't get 600-calorie muffin, later, 2 seconds later, you're going to get something high. So I don't know if any of you have seen that story.
So that's very consistent with my chocolate cake story.
Yeah.
So yeah, you feel proud, you feel like you've shown restraint, you've been a good person. So the next time you have to make a decision, you're less controlled about it.
Again, I just want to make one more comment, is that we are all, again, general comment, we are all fascinated by these irrational behaviors. And when I saw this first study on the opting out and opting in for organ donors, I was amazed. But one reason we are fascinated by this is because there is some basic rationality in our head. So otherwise, we wouldn't be fascinated seeing people having irrational behavior. So I just want to make the point that there is a lot of rational behavior going around, but no one is excited about it because that's what we expect people to do. And markets do work. When price goes down, people buy more. When price goes up, people buy less. Although there is a lot of research in psychology that indicate that people willingness to pay is something very vague notion, and people are not. How much people are willing to pay for something is not clear. But still, when people look at the aggregate and look at markets, a lot of the predictions do work. Okay.
Right. So just one more on the food. So one of the things that I'm aware of, because it's a client, is Weight Watchers. So they have the long shadow of the future. So what they do is they try to train people to have this budget for, let's say, a week, which is about as much as you can have for a food budget. And they try to get you to, in fact, do make the rational decisions over a long period of time. And so, I mean, all these things that you're talking about, I guess that's the issue, is to have this future to influence you so that you do continue to make the rational decisions at the moment rather than, rewarding yourself. So have you, in terms of changing behavior, have you worked with that at all?
So there's a lot of work on something called implementation intentions, which is the closest to what you're talking about. So there's some work by a psychologist at NYU who shows that if you do exactly what you're doing, you have a long-term goal, and then you have like these plans, you set up these plans that help you get to that goal. And he has these studies that work like magic. So you actually set up these plans and people get where they need to get much more than if they don't set up these if-then kinds of plans. If I see this chocolate cake, I'm going to stay away, or if this happens, then I'll do this. So those kinds of plans have been shown to really help you achieve your goals.
Let me just add one example because I think it addresses the point that, yes, markets work in the right direction. Prices go up, consumption goes down. But we're in a world now where often it's a matter of getting better than vaguely right. And I'll give you one example when it comes to voting. There was a study was just accepted in Psych Science where they tried to increase voting turnout. Of course, you could pay people to vote. That used to happen. It still happens in New Jersey, apparently. The second thing you could do is you could get out the vote campaigns, which is, of course, you do phone calls. What they did was simply ask people, are you going to vote? And if so, what would stop you? And how would you overcome that? And the implementation, it's exactly from this research. 4% increase in voter turnout in those people who answered the question. That's, a very cheap, not everything is always, expensive, and the big advantage of the behavioral approach, I think, is because it is so efficient.
Other questions? Yeah, sir.
Very much interested in, Professor Johnson, what you're talking about with choice architecture. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit. So you talked about the default setting being very significant. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about other factors that might be significant in the way choices are presented, either the brevity of the description or the type of words used or other issues that are involved.
So I'll give a plug, not to my book, but some friends of mine, Dick Thaler and Cass Sunstein, have written a book called Nudge, which actually is where the term choice architecture is taken from. It talks about tons of people's research, but they did a very nice job of summarizing it. Just give you a couple examples. One is we know that if you sort a list, you all see Consumer Reports types of lists. If you sort it by that attribute will get more weight. So the famous study in this area uses wine. You can sort by price or sort by wine advocate rating. People buy much better wine when it's sorted by wine advocate rating. There's a lot of examples. In fact, we are working on a book that actually codifies a lot of the choice architecture notion, but that, to me, is a nice example I think is intuitive. Not to mention says how you should run your wine store and what wine store I want to go to. Yeah.
Yeah, on the subject of like how often people check their balances and whether or not that affects trade. Previous research has suggested that excessive trade just hurts people in the long run. So, in fact, excessive trading could be seen as fundamentally irrational, at least ex post. Now that we know that research, then people might conclude that I should trade less. So maybe somehow inadvertently, markets go down. This might be good, although unintentionally people check their balances less, people trade less, and this might be good for people. Or what are your thoughts on that possibility?
When it comes to Vanguard, the accounts that I look are 401k accounts, so trading is maybe not the right word. So there is not much of trading that people do. Usually has to do with rebalancing their portfolio. And there I think there is a lot of research that shows that there is too little going on. People, for example, I never touched my saving accounts, while I should have changed the composition. So financial advisors tell you that when you age, you should shift it more towards bonds than stocks, and people do too little of those things. So the type of accounts that I look at, the point that you're making, which I think is a very correct point, I don't think it applies to those accounts.
But perhaps maybe the Pittsburgh or the Swedish brokerage accounts would be very different kinds of accounts. If they're more traditional brokerage accounts with normal kinds of trading.
No, if it's true that for whatever reason people are trading more than they should have based on some rational model, then imposing on them additional cost that they will do less of it may be good for them. This I don't know.
Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, have there been studies done to show how robust the choice architecture phenomenon is? Because it seems like something like organ donation, generally you do have a tendency to want to donate. So where the decision is maybe not such a hard one, choice architecture plays a much more significant role. But have there been studies shown sort of to where the limit is? So if it is at all actually contentious, does choice architecture play any role?
So is the question if they're really important decisions? Organ donation is a pretty important decision to the person who's a recipient, but obviously you're not around to see the consequences.
It's like a social good, but maybe in a commercial setting or in a business setting.
So we do work with firms, and I'll give you one example. A large German auto manufacturer, who will remain nameless, runs a website where you configure cars. You probably have been to these kinds of sites. And you actually get to select with HTML what is the default option. So I'll just give you one fact. This is in Germany with German speakers. They have 16 different engine choices they can choose between. Changing the default can triple the share of an engine, and we're talking about decisions that range in the thousands of dollars. That's a very big, so some of that work is described in this if you're interested. But and another example is in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, auto insurance. Pennsylvania and New Jersey did the same reform, which was very nice. They give up the right to sue, you get cheaper policies. But in Pennsylvania, the right to sue was the default. In New Jersey, the right not to sue, the giving up the right to sue was the default. And our calculations is that's $2 billion more insurance was sold in Pennsylvania than in New Jersey because of the change in defaults. Last question, who do you think lobbied at the last minute to get the default changed in Pennsylvania? Can you say trial lawyer?
I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the early example of doctors that get to make choices about immunization shots. The results are amazing. This is like 30 years old result that doctors are given statistics about the effect of immunization shot on death rates or and they get, one group gets it in terms of death rates, and the other group gets the same statistics in terms of success rates, and they make totally different choices about whether to recommend or not to recommend the immunization of children. So it's very, very powerful. Some of these results are frightening.
Yes,
in terms of the organ donation, if people's behavior were manipulated illegally, so how should we deal with the ethical problems?
It's a very good question because it raises a good, important question, which is, what's the choice architect trying to do? And actually, if I can, I found an ad having seen this. Can I just show you one example of someone trying to overcome a bias, perhaps in a way that will make them money, but also make consumers better off? I think this would be. This was an ad Schwab ran in 2003.
Just your broker's statement, Al.
Avoiding your portfolio won't make it any better. Get a fresh start with Charles Schwab. For a limited time, we'll help you rebalance your portfolio and include recommended equity trades for only $95. Call 1-800-4-SCHWAB.
So, not to belittle a question, because it really is an important question, because there are going to be times when there's no win-win. But here, understanding the bias allowed Schwab to try and make people make better decisions by selling the losers and look at their statement and make a profit. So there are going to be times where it's just an ethical dilemma, and I agree with that. But there's also times where knowing this, you can help people make better decisions. And that's the kind of marketing I like.
Any other questions? Going once? Yes, Alka.
Just make a public service announcement for now. It's okay to open the envelopes again.
That's true. Mark, it was a good day today.
But also, a serious question,
but why do you think it has to be one or the other? Why does it have to be rational or irrational, rather than sort of looking for the optimal balance and trying to diagnose which happens when and how to help people overcome, those instances where they might not be doing what's most rational?
So again, I'm not a psychologist, but it seems to be that people have this ostrich effect in not only the context of financial stuff. I think that Andy Kaplan wrote some stuff that related to medicine. So we know that there is some more valid information that we should acquire, and it seems to be that there is psychological reasons that prevents us from acquiring it, right? And so I don't understand what exactly you mean by one way or the other.
you were suggesting that economics is all for the rational and psychology is all for the irrational, and that they never shall the two meet.
I think they should meet.
At least date.
But I don't think they should fight. So it's not about...
And they have met. The freshmen at Columbia used my textbook, which has 2 chapters on psychology and behavior, which I think is unique among principles books. But there's a new generation of this stuff coming, so I think there's a lot more love and less war. How about that? Other questions, thoughts? Well, if not, let's thank our panelists for really